We're diving into a story today. It's a disturbing one. It involves an elementary school teacher from New Jersey, Caron. She's been accused of sexually abusing one of her students.
And the abuse allegedly went on for years.
Years.
What makes this case even more disturbing is that the student was only 11 years old when the abuse started.
11 years old.
And it came to light in a really shocking way.
Yeah, you could say that.
Yeah.
The victim's father. He noticed a resemblance between his son and a baby in one of Karen's Facebook posts.
Yeah.
And as it turns out, that baby is allegedly the result of the abuse. So, to try and make sense of all this, we've got news articles, court documents, even some social media posts.
Our mission today is to really unpack the facts of the case, but also go deeper. Look at the grooming process, the psychology of the abuse, and all the legal complexities.
Okay, so let's start with a timeline. The abuse allegedly went on from 2016 to 2020. And we know Karen was 28 years old when she allegedly gave birth to the victim's child in 2019.
And then in December 2024, the victim's father, he makes that Facebook post.
Okay.
And that's when everything unravels.
It's interesting. We always warn our kids about stranger danger. But this case is a stark reminder that abuse often comes from the people we know and trust.
Absolutely. And that's what makes grooming so insidious. It's not just a one-time event. It's a calculated process. These abusers use it to gain access and control over their victims.
So help me understand this process a little better. How does someone like Karen, a teacher, allegedly groom a student? Is it all about, being extra nice, offering help after class?
It can start that way, building a rapport by showing a special interest in the student, but it goes much deeper. Abusers. They manipulate vulnerabilities, they create a sense of dependence, they isolate the victim from their support systems, and they gradually normalize inappropriate behavior.
It's horrifying to think about, and what makes this case even more complex is the involvement of the victim's siblings.
Yes, their accounts are incredibly important. The sister told investigators she saw her brother in Karen's bed, and she noticed Karen locking the bathroom door when he was showering. The victim's brother even claims to have witnessed the abuse directly.
Multiple witnesses like that must be crucial in a case like this.
Absolutely. Child sex abuse cases often lack physical evidence or involve delayed disclosure. So having these accounts from the siblings can be incredibly valuable for investigators and prosecutors.
Of course, we also have that unusual piece of evidence, the baby. DNA testing must be pretty crucial.
It is. DNA testing can confirm paternity and solidify the timeline of events, which is essential in a case like this. And that brings us to another disturbing aspect of this case, the living arrangement.
Right. It started with sleepovers at Karen's house.
Yeah.
And then the victim and his siblings actually moved in with her permanently.
And Karen wasn't just a babysitter. She became their legal guardian as a resource family parent, which is essentially New Jersey's term for a foster parent.
So that just adds another layer of complexity.
It does. It blurs the lines even further. Here you have a teacher who becomes a foster parent to the very child. She's allegedly abusing the level of control, and manipulation is staggering, and it might help explain why the victim, now an adult, admitted to staying in contact with Karen until his father's Facebook post brought everything to light.
That just seems so counterintuitive. Why would a victim maintain contact with their abuser?
The psychological effects of abuse, especially when it occurs over a long period of time and involves someone in a position of authority, can be profound. It often creates a very complicated dynamic where the victim may feel a sense of loyalty, dependence, or even love for their abuser.
It's hard to wrap your head around, especially for someone who hasn't experienced that kind of trauma. So what are some of the other psychological impacts that might be at play here?
Well, shame is a big one. Victims often blame themselves for what happened, feeling like they somehow invited or deserved the abuse. This can make it incredibly difficult for them to come forward, to tell their stories, and seek help.
And I imagine the fear of not being believed, especially when the abuser is someone seemingly trustworthy, like a teacher, can also play a role.
Absolutely. Victims may fear retaliation from the abuser or worry that their families won't believe them. They might also worry about the consequences of speaking out, the potential disruption to their lives and the lives of those around them.
This case really throws into sharp relief the complexities of child abuse and the long-lasting trauma it can inflict. But before we delve deeper into the psychological aspects, let's shift gears for a moment and explore the legal side of things. What specific charges is Caron facing, and what kind of legal battles are we likely to see unfold?
Caron is facing some really serious charges. In New Jersey, Aggravated sexual assault carries a sentence of 10 to 20 years.
Wow. And that's not all right.
Right. There's also a possibility of additional charges, like second-degree sexual assault and child endangerment. Each of those could mean another 5 to 10 years.
So we're potentially talking about decades behind bars. What factors are going to determine the severity of her sentence if she is convicted?
Well, the court will consider a number of things. The victim's age at the time of the abuse is critical, as is the duration of the abuse. The existence of corroborating evidence, like those witness testimonies from the siblings, and the DNA evidence will also come into play.
It's interesting that you mentioned the siblings' testimonies, because there's a report that the victim actually tried to protect Caron. Even after the truth came out, he allegedly called his younger brother, confessed to be the father of Caron's child, and begged his sister to keep it all a secret. Why would he do that?
Well, that's a classic example of the complex psychological dynamics we talked about earlier. Victims often develop this distorted sense of loyalty or protectiveness towards their abuser.
That's so difficult to grasp, especially from an outsider's perspective. It seems illogical to want to protect someone who has hurt you so deeply.
It might seem illogical, but it's important to remember that abuse often warps a victim's sense of reality. They may feel responsible for the abuse, or fear the consequences of speaking out, or even believe that they are somehow in love with their abuser. These feelings can be incredibly powerful and make it extremely difficult for victims to break free.
It makes you wonder how many other cases are out there where victims are suffering in silence, trapped by these complex emotions.
That's a sobering thought, and it underscores the importance of creating a culture where victims feel safe to come forward.
Absolutely. But let's get back to Laura Caron's case. What are some possible legal strategies that her defense team might use?
Well, they could try to discredit the witnesses, particularly the victim's siblings. They might point to inconsistencies in their accounts or suggest that they have ulterior motives for testifying against Caron.
So basically, trying to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jury.
Exactly. However, that strategy becomes much harder. Now, the DNA evidence, it's pretty difficult to dispute the paternity test.
That makes sense. What about a plea deal? Is that a possibility in a case like this?
Plea deals are definitely on the table. Caron's lawyer might try to negotiate a lesser charge or a reduced sentence in exchange for a guilty plea. This would avoid the uncertainty of a trial and potentially spare the victim and his family the trauma of having to testify in court.
It sounds like there are a lot of factors at play here, legally and emotionally. It makes me think of the case of Elisa McCon, the Tennessee teacher, who was sentenced to 25 years for raping a 12-year-old student and fathering his child. Are there any parallels between that case and this one?
There are definitely some similarities. Both cases involve teachers in positions of authority abusing their students, resulting in pregnancy and ultimately severe legal consequences. The McCon case serves as a stark reminder of the devastating impact this kind of abuse can have, not only on the victim, but also on their families and communities.
The McCon case also brought up some very complex issues regarding child custody. The victim's mother ended up gaining custody of the child. Is it possible that something similar could happen in Caron's case?
It's certainly a possibility. When a child is conceived as a result of sexual assault, custody arrangements can be incredibly challenging. Courts prioritize the best interests of the child, which means considering the victim's age, their ability to care for the child, and the potential emotional impact on everyone involved.
It seems like navigating the legal and emotional complexities of a case like this is like walking through a minefield. There are so many potential pitfalls and unintended consequences.
That's a very apt analogy. These cases present unique challenges for everyone involved. For the victim, it's about finding the strength to come forward and heal. For the legal system, it's about ensuring justice is served while also protecting the well-being of the child. And for society as a whole, it's about confronting uncomfortable truths and working to prevent these tragedies from happening in the first place.
We've covered a lot of ground here. We examined the timeline of the abuse, explored the psychology of grooming and the lasting trauma it can cause, and even delves into the potential legal battles ahead. But I think what stuck with me the most is this unsettling realization that abusers often hide in plain sight.
That's a key takeaway here. We need to move beyond the simplistic notion of stranger danger and recognize that abuse can happen anywhere, even in the seemingly safest of environments. Schools, churches, sports teams, even our own homes. These are all places where abusers can operate.
You're absolutely right, and it's a sobering reminder that we all have a role to play in protecting children. Before we delve deeper into that, let's pause for a moment
Mm-hmm.
and shift our focus to the broader societal implications
Yeah.
of this case. What does Laura Caron's story tell us about the systems that are supposed to protect our children? And what can we do to improve those systems and create a world where children are truly safe?
This case really exposes some vulnerabilities in our systems. You know, we have background checks for teachers and policies against inappropriate relationships, but clearly those weren't enough here.
Yeah, and we saw how the victim and his siblings ended up living with Caron.
Yeah.
With the state essentially sanctioning that arrangement. Does that point to flaws in the foster care system too?
It certainly raises questions. How thoroughly was Caron vetted? Were there any red flags that were missed? Was there adequate oversight once the children were placed in her care? These are all questions that investigators are going to need to answer.
It's a lot to unpack. It makes you wonder how many other kids might be slipping through the cracks.
And that's why this conversation is so important. We need to be talking about these issues, demanding better protections for children, and supporting organizations that work to prevent abuse and help survivors.
So where do we even begin? What concrete steps can we take to create a safer environment for kids?
Well, on an individual level, education is key. We need to teach children about body safety, healthy boundaries, and how to recognize and report abuse. We also need to educate ourselves as adults about the signs of grooming and abuse and be vigilant in our communities.
So it's not just about telling kids to be wary of strangers. It's about empowering them to speak up if someone, anyone, makes them feel uncomfortable.
Exactly. And we need to create a culture where children feel believed and supported when they do come forward. Too often, victims are silenced by shame, fear, or disbelief. We need to change that.
And what about systemic changes? What needs to happen at the policy level to better protect children?
Well, we need stronger background checks for anyone working with children, mandatory reporting laws, and more robust oversight of foster care systems. And we need to adequately fund child protection agencies and support organizations that provide services to victims and their families.
It's a multifaceted problem that requires a multifaceted solution.
Absolutely. It requires a collective effort from individuals, communities, and institutions. We all have a responsibility to protect children.
This deep dive has been incredibly informative, but it's also been incredibly heavy. It's hard to grapple with the fact that someone entrusted with the care of children could betray that trust so profoundly.
It is heavy, but I think it's important to remember that while there is darkness in the world, there is also light. There are countless individuals and organizations dedicated to protecting children and supporting survivors, and there is hope for healing and justice.
As we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. We've explored the details of this case, the complexities of abuse and the systems that failed these children. But the most crucial takeaway, the one I hope stays with you long after this deep dive ends, is this. We can't be passive observers. We must be active participants in creating a world where all children are safe, respected, and empowered to speak their truth.
And if this deep dive has sparked something in you, a desire to learn more, to get involved, to make a difference, then please don't ignore that impulse. Act on it. Reach out to organizations in your community. Educate yourself. And be an advocate for children. Every voice matters. Every action counts. Together, we can create a world where stories like Laura Caron's become the exception, not the rule.